How does a legacy Filipino American community in Stockton, California, at one time the largest outside of the Philippines, overcome marginalization to truly shape their community and their destiny? Little Manila Rising thinks it knows the way to racial and social justice. A conversation with its executive director, Dillon Delvo, next on Emil Takeout. It's Emil Takeout. I'm Emil Guillermo. We do a daily show Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific on Facebook /EmilGuillermo.media. Also on the Emil Guillermo YouTube channel and on AMOK.com. But on this, our special edition podcast of Emil Takeout, we continue to showcase the evolution of Little Manila Rising and how it's become a vital player among nonprofits in the Stockton-San Joaquin County area of California's Central Valley. Formed in the early 2000s as a community nonprofit to preserve and spread Filipino culture, arts, and history, founders Dillon Delvo and the late Don Mabalan have seen their mission evolve. Now it's all of the above, plus the urgent needs of the community right now, like public health initiatives to fight asthma, environmental justice efforts like air monitoring, or going beyond the preservation of old buildings to owning and developing new community spaces of their own. Other communities in the state do that sort of thing, but not Stockton's Filipino community. Dillon Delvo talks about how he and Don Mabalan came back from grad school to Stockton and found no way to make a personal impact on their community. So they built something themselves, a nonprofit that is giving not just Filipino Americans in South Stockton, but all its diverse residents a way to shape and develop their community and assert the power that's been denied them for decades. Don's passing in 2018 left Delvo as the executive director, and since then, Little Manila Rising has grown. Delvo told me Little Manila's concerns have always been about more than just the Filipino American community.
I think it's always been expansive. I think one of the interesting things is that we're a community that's really kind of emerging from marginalization. And interestingly enough, I think part of the marginalization, and I think obviously the intricate ways racism still kind of has a grip on society is much more nuanced. And obviously, there are now great examples happening right now in the news that kind of display that type of nuanced racism, which is not. I mean, the ramifications are not nuanced at all. But I think one of the things that you need to understand about Little Manila Rising is that oftentimes people continue to silo us as a Filipino organization. And I know that sounds ridiculous in the fact that I'm saying, oh yeah, our organization is named Little Manila Rising. But if you look at the history of it, in 2003, when we fought the city to save our three buildings, the RFP, the request for proposal from the city, was to come up with a development plan for 8 square blocks. And of those 8 square blocks, there were the 3 buildings, which was just really on a quarter of one of the 8 square blocks. And so in order to save those 3 buildings, so obviously we were grounded in Filipino American history and to save and the preservation of that. But in order to do that, we had to come up with a redevelopment plan for 8 square blocks in which there were over 50 families who lived there, most of which were not Filipino. Matter of fact, we only found one Filipino family there back in 2003. It was mostly Black, Latinx, and Chinese in that community.
Wow. Really diverse, super diverse.
Yeah. I mean, well, and it speaks to the real destruction of urban redevelopment in the 1960s, building Crosstown Freeway, which was once, Little Manila, once the largest population outside of the Philippines of Filipinos in the world, to find, after the building of the Crosstown Freeway in the late 60s to early 70s, now only one Filipino family in that community, right? So in order to save the 3 buildings, historical buildings, we had to engage with a community that wasn't Filipino. And what we found was a community that had been disenfranchised because the city had always planned to build retail next to the freeway. And so since the 1960s, these families were receiving letters of eminent domain. And because the city knew that they wanted to destroy that area, put no money into that area. To this day, there are no wheelchair accessible ramps on any of the corners of the sidewalks. So no curb cuts,
Yeah.
which is against the law. And the sidewalks are cracked, the streets are cracked. No money has been put into this. And so what happened since the 60s, the valuation of that neighborhood has gone down, down, down. And when you're talking about 2003, the bubble was growing on the housing market. And remember, eventually what would happen is, the housing prices were skyrocketing. This is what happening in 2003. And now as we're engaging with this community, they're now receiving a new letter of eminent domain. And so a city that has devalued that community to make it the lowest value real estate in the area now wants to take their property, give them fair market value. So they drove down the prices while new housing was skyrocketing. It was the most unethical thing. And so at that point, because not only is it the homes of families, but it's also there was over like 10 BIPOC owned businesses in that area. There are other nonprofits located in that area. It really becomes a story of the historical way people of color have been treated by the city of Stockton, by the state and the feds, and marginalized.
Yeah.
Whether you take it all the way back to redlining, the cultural values between North and South, and all these things that took place, we had to confront that. And so the reality of it is that Little Manila, from its beginnings, was always a racial equity organization. We just happen to be all of Filipino roots. And yes, it's our Filipino American history that dictates that. And so we take that story, right? We take that story, our story of our people, and we offer it as just one example of many of marginalization. And we come in allyship to really not just serve Filipino Americans, but to serve specifically South Stockton.
Yeah. And so what you discovered, you went into this and you really uncovered this vast history that was happening, that has roots in the past, but in the present, you found the present day administrators, the fathers of Stockton, now driving down prices and calculating the blight so they could get that area at the cheapest rate and then do with it what they would or what they will. And you're right in the middle of all that. And you discovered that there were these natural allies with the Filipino community. And when we say BIPOC, it's Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It was the full range. You got into it fairly innocently, looking at just the three buildings. But when you realized it was broader, there had to be a kind of evolution when you notice, oh, this is really happening.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you look at it, both Don and I, Dr. Don Mabalo and I come from an ethnic studies perspective, right? And we both went to Edison High School. So if you're from South Stockton, you know what exactly that means. You're coming from an extremely diverse high school, from an extremely diverse part of town, right? Yeah. Where you grow up with friends of all cultures, right? We're all into hip hop. We are all sharing these things. We're all playing on the streets together. That is family to us. So interestingly enough, though, we keep putting, there's, because we're called Little Manila, we keep being placed in this silo of Filipino-ness. And so I think one of the most regretful things I have about that experience is that the narrative from saving, those three buildings was Filipino group saves Filipino American history. And yes, that is true. But I think the even greater narrative that never really got told to the extent is that, yes, we did that, but we also saved the homes of over 50 families, low income families in our community, businesses, BIPOC owned businesses and nonprofits that are serving the poor in our community. And I think in the end, what that does is it kind of not that saving our history isn't important enough, but I think it lessens the impact of what we actually did as a community, and it lessens the scope of what we should be about, right? Like why do we keep being put into the silo? I mean, of course we're respectful and we want to uplift our history and our community, but the simple fact is we did save those families' homes. In the end, we're not going to get out of marginalization unless we find true allyship amongst those that are marginalized.
Right. Well, the whole idea of Little Manila and then now Little Manila Rising is that it has expanded. The purview has expanded. The allies have expanded. Your impact, you realize, has expanded, and also the narrative. The narrative of what you've done and what you're doing has expanded. Do you think perhaps what when I say they, I'm talking about people who say, okay, good, you've done this for the Filipinos and the Filipino community. Now just go away. We've done the buildings. Now go away. Is it maybe done to maybe minimize what you could do in the future, or maybe to say, okay, your work is done. So long, no more funding. I mean, do you find it maybe as a kind of a negative way to get, not to negate or get back at Little Manila, but just to say, okay, we've done you. Now we're moving on.
Yeah, I think it's a strategy.
Yeah.
Right. Because if this is a one-shot deal, then maybe you give the benefit of the doubt. But what we learned from the farm labor movement, right, that only happens because of the unity and the allyship between the Filipino and Latinx community, right? And I actually think if you only tell the one perspective, whether it be Latinx or Filipino perspective, if you just tell that one perspective, it really takes away from the greater story of what actually happened, right? One of the greatest social justice movements in American history. You need to tell the whole story and not just half the story. And I think that's purposely done because we all know that there's a tactic that if you can play races against each other, right, then that means you're not attacking the real issue. And for us, the real issue is white supremacy. And when I mean white supremacy, I'm talking, we define that as the dehumanization of anything not white, right? And so, yeah, I think that's where we are as an organization. I think we've always been there. Like when we fought for ethnic studies to be implemented in the Stockton Unified School District, we didn't just fight so that Filipino students can can have ethnic studies. When we sued the UC Regents for the use of the SAT, ACT for college admissions, knowing its background in eugenics and all of the unethical and disenfranchising things that test has done to our communities. We didn't just do it for the Filipino community. We did it for all of our children. Not to take away from our story, because of course we're going to, that's the story that we can tell because that's who we are, yeah. Right? I think people try to silo us in that, really to diminish it. And it's kind of like, I don't know, as a Filipino, I don't know, Emil, if you've ever experienced this, but, if I've met with some white folks that, even though they lived in Stockton and all that kind of stuff, and Stockton had the highest population of Filipinos in the world from the 1920s and 1960s, deep roots and all that kind of stuff. And when I connect with these people, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, "Oh, did you bring lumpia?" Right? It's like this. It's this. It's this dehumanizing, right? Like, oh, it's a Filipino person. The only way I can relate to you is this, crispy spring roll. Like I'm a giant lumpia, walking around, and the simple truth is, when I see them, I don't think, hey, ooh, like, did you bring some turkey with you or some mashed potatoes?
Mashed potatoes, yeah.
That's the last thing from my mind.
Dillon, what it says is we have this really very cursory, this is the way people relate to each other. People always say it's through the food. And so it's a kind of, we can put them down for say, hey, for mentioning lumpia first, but it shouldn't be lumpia first and last. And I think that's what happens, that it's often that's as deep as they go. But or it's in accompaniment with a deeper conversation about who we are and what we're about. But yeah, I know when I see a white person, I don't say, "Oh, mashed potatoes." The first time I had
Yeah,
mashed
yeah.
potatoes, you know.
Oh, and here's the worst. I've met with farmers,
Yeah,
right? Like old school farmers from out in the Delta and all
yeah,
that kind of stuff. And they'll recognize me as Filipino and they'll come to me and I was just like, and they'll be like, I love Filipinos.
yeah,
No one has worked harder for me than Filipinos. The Filipino people are great people. They're hard
yeah,
workers.
yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, they've already
And
cast you in that role. They've
which
already
sounds
cast you in the
great,
role. Yeah,
right? Which sounds great. But what you're saying is that of all the races that you tried to take advantage of
yeah,
by getting cheap labor and becoming wealthy off of their labor,
yeah,
Filipinos are the best of them, right? They're the good ones.
yeah.
And I think these are the dialogues that we need to have, because this is where institutionalized racism still exists. People don't understand these dynamics, and it does take a lot more critical thought. And I think one of the great things, and I'm glad that we're doing this interview now, because I know we were supposed to do it a week earlier, but I've been watching what's been happening in the NFL,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And I think I was just like, wow, the Brian Flores lawsuit really encapsulates how racism gets played out today, right?
yeah,
Where before it was kind of this glass ceiling and all that kind of stuff.
yeah,
Um, but I think we've emerged from the glass ceiling thing
yeah.
to now I think this is all about, well, it's either create a policy to check off a box,
Right.
right? So policy is changing, and I think everyone thinks, okay, well, if we create a policy, then everything's going to be okay.
That's all right. Yeah,
As if that can't be undermined, right?
yeah,
As if that can't be undermined, and so for people who don't know, right? So Brian Flores is a black coach, NFL coach, and he was a former coach of the Miami Dolphins, who was interviewing for a job with
New York Giants.
New York Giants. Yes, he was getting ready, or he had not yet interviewed for the job. He was asked to interview for the job, and he receives a text from Bill Belichick, who's the coach of the Patriots, and really dialed in. The other guy who actually got the job, his first name is Brian, and he accidentally texts this other guy who's about to go into his interview. Congratulations on getting the job. He was really talking about the real guy who got a job.
Who's white?
Who's white. But he's left standing there, and it's like, wait, why am I interviewing for a job that has already been given to someone else? There's this rule called the Rooney Rule, right? That said the policy was teams have to interview at least one or two BIPOC people for these jobs. And so they had already known who they wanted to give the job to, but they were just bringing him in to check off that box.
It's show business. It's I'm glad you're bringing this up, because the NFL and football has become America's pastime. It used to be baseball, but it truly now is football. And people do not see racism at all the other institutions in America. They can't relate to corporate or, the high levels of racism. They might begin to think about it in terms of schools and education. When you talk about football, now people have a way of understanding. Now people see it. And I thought Colin Kaepernick was a way for people to see it, right? To see racism in action. But what's happened to the Kaepernick case? It really has kind of fizzled. People were now end racism on the back of their helmets. But what if they didn't give Colin Kaepernick a break? And now here's Brian Flores bringing this out in public so people can see where the real racism is. And this is an opportunity. Like you said, this is an opportunity to see how it really works. This, where HR controls everything. You can select the white candidate you want, but just, collect the resumes of all the people of color. Check the box and make it look like, this is the show business. Make it look like there's no racism.
Yeah. And so it's, what it becomes is rather than actual racial equity that's taking place, it's racial equity theater. And I bring that up, and why I think that's an incredible example for people to kind of understand this is it is the same issue that we have with the implementation of AB 617, which is a state law that's supposed to disperse state funds, cap and trade funds, and to empower community to to clean their air. And I think what we experienced as an organization through the process was racial equity theater, right? It was checking off a box. And so if you want to know more about there's articles in Cal Matters. Cal Matters article just came up, kind of details this, not just the story of Stockton, but also Wilmington in Southern California and other places. They say it's about community, but it's really still the same institutions that are just doing what they want to do. They're just kind of conducting racial equity theater.
Let's just expand on cap and trade and AB 617. AB 617 was a law that said we are going to get money from companies who pollute. And that money is going to be used to abate pollution, air pollution primarily, in all these communities, and the communities had to be identified. But define the cap and trade part. Cap and trade means...
Just over the past 2 years, we are very new to the environmental justice realm, right? We come from historic preservation and ethnic studies. But we come into the environmental justice world specifically because of the same reason why Little Manila was destroyed, right? The building of a freeway, right? We understand that this freeway destroyed our community. And when the Grain Lining Institute reached out to us and said, hey, did you know that where your historic site is, it's in the 100 percentile for asthma-related issues in California? And which at that point in 2017, we're like, well, or 2016, like, well, what are we supposed to do about that? That's not our organization. But then in 2018, with the passing of our co-founder and my dear friend, Dr. Don Mabalon, an asthma attack triggered her passing, we realized that it was something that we could not address. So I think we've been staring at these three buildings, and really what we needed to do around was do a 90-degree turn and look at both those buildings and that freeway that destroyed this community, and a freeway that's still poisoning our people today. Yeah. And so we engaged in this. And so cap and trade was funding that we were made aware of by other organizations, because our communities like Stockton had never received this type of funding for environmental justice. So at the time when we were introduced to it, I felt, oh, wow, this is amazing, an amazing opportunity for us to get resources so that we can bolster, the efforts here in Stockton, especially for those, that are facing asthma, right? Like, asthma is so prevalent in our community that parents in South Stockton, they don't even trip when their child has asthma, because everyone else's kids have asthma. Yeah. It's culturally accepted. And the simple truth is, over 90% of industrial zoning is located in South Stockton. And so that means it's okay for them to pollute specifically in South Stockton. And it's so ingrained in the community that parents just accept that their child has asthma as if it's the same thing as just having like allergies. Yeah. But people die. People's lives have been shortened by this. And we know this because we've had to experience it in a very difficult way in losing one of the most amazing people, I've ever met in my life, Dr. Don Mabalon. And we realized that, in order to save her life at the age of 46, someone needed to intervene to clean her air in her community in South Stockton when she was 7 years old, right? And every day, a child becomes 7 years old in Stockton, and we couldn't save hers, but hopefully, we can save others. And so we engaged in this really naively, and through the process, we got to have a better understanding. We went into it like full on, yes, let's work together, Air District, and
Yeah.
and then found that a lot of the solutions were already prescribed,
Ah.
already pre-prescribed, and really they were just kind of just getting us to kind of okay things, and we had to fight for anything that the community specifically, any specific things that the community wanted. But at the same time, we were a community that was kind of uneducated in these issues, and so we had a lot to learn about it. And it was really tough to try to figure all that stuff out within the time frame that they had. But after all this time, I now understand where environmental justice kind of warriors fall on this, right? They were not in support of cap and trade, because end of the day doesn't solve the real issue. Basically, if companies pollute, they pay a penalty. It's kind of pay to pollute.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, and that's something that can just be budgeted in to your thing. And so, is it enough to cut down the emissions to save human life? And it's a negotiation between the needs of a market and the needs of humanity. And so I totally understand that from that perspective. But at the same time, there's no way that we would have been able to build the capacity that we're building right now if those funds weren't made available to us. So it's really it's a mixed bag for
Right.
us.
But that's what happens. Cap and trade gets the money. Pay to pollute idea. The companies that pollute pay into the state, into this fund, and they pollute. And then these funds through AB 617 are distributed to cities or communities that are identified like Little Manila. And that I just wanted to explain how that happens. Now you have the money, but you find that as you get the money to do something, you find that you have been put in a position where all the actions that the Air District and the Car Board and that all the organizations, the government organizations want to do are pretty much pre-prescribed or preordained. They're going to do what they just want the community group like a Little Manila and the environmental justice warriors like yourself just to kind of rubber stamp what they want. Is that your experience?
That's what it feels like, right? I'm no longer a part of that committee. We have other staff that's now on that committee, which is, I think more beneficial. Like, we now have, I think, qualified people helping to give input into that community, into that steering committee. But it's not like, so there's this thing that had to be created over the course of a year. It's called the SERP. It's the Community Emissions Reduction Plan. It's not like we sat down and wrote it, right? Their district, they wrote it all. And I think part of the other thing too is that, like, the way the legislation is written is that it's really the local entities who control and regulate kind of air, really can create their own rules. And so for our area, for the Stockton area, we're a part of the San Joaquin Valley Pollution Control District. I think I'm leaving a word out of there, but that stretches all the way down to like Fresno, right? All the way up to Stockton, even further on, I think, into Kern County. So the rules that they come up with can be very different from what other air districts are doing. So, for example, in LA, and I think it was East LA, in their community process, they actually had a budgeting, participatory budgeting process, which at the time, if we would have known that we could have done that, we would have said, yeah, we want to do something like that. Like, why can they engage in a process, in a budgeting process, and we weren't able to engage in a budgeting process? Like, why is it possible to do that in one part of California and not able to do that in another part of California, especially when, the state legislation is written at the state level?
Do you feel like you were taken advantage of somewhat because of the relative inexperience, or was that calculated to not allow Stockton to have a say?
So I think this comes to the issue of the notion of California or the way California is represented, right? When most people think California, they're thinking like, oh, ultra progressive, like liberal, all this kind of stuff. They're all tree huggers. But the simple truth is there's a huge difference between the Central Valley and the coastal regions of California. Yep. And Hollywood doesn't exist in the Central Valley, right? So there are huge inequities that exist, racial inequities at every data point, whether it be education, environmental justice, between the Central Valley of California and the coastal regions. Huge difference. It might as well be like two different states. I think what happens is that when state legislation is written, the folks who get to implement it are the local jurisdictions. Say the way the Bay Area Air District would interpret a rule may be completely different from the way the San Joaquin Valley Air District would interpret it. In the end, that comes down to a certain culture within those areas. And so I think that's the thing that's never talked about. It's, we have a policy, and so we've taken care of it. But the real issue that exists is the culture that permeates an organization, right? And so just to bring it back to the NFL, right? The NFL can create the Rooney Rule, right? That says, hey, you need to interview a person of color to be a head coach. But if the culture, which is controlled by the owner of the team, right, isn't one of equity, racial equity, you're not going to get it. It doesn't matter what that rule is. Then they're just going to do what is racial equity theater, right? And end of the day, I'm sure that the owner of the New York Giants right now is kicking himself, because really, in his mind, I think right now, like if he did it, I mean, allegedly, this is what's happened, but he's probably saying right now, damn it, if I would have just interviewed him first. Right? Yeah. Or if I would have if we could have scheduled it earlier,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
we would have gotten away with it.
Now that you see it, how is it not helping Little Manila as much as it could?
So, for example, the main data points that come out of major corporations who pollute in our community are self-reported. So we're in the process of, one of the things, we received grant funding to create a community monitored or community run air monitoring system, right? Because what we're dealing with is decades of, I mean, if you have a corporation that says, oh, this is how we're polluting, like, how do we know that you're telling the truth, right? Like, and so what was interesting was that no one in the air district, San Joaquin Valley, when we brought up, hey, we'd like to fund a community-run air monitoring system, they're like, what are you talking about? I don't understand. What is a community-run air monitoring system? Even though other communities like in West Oakland already have these types of systems in place and have empowered community members, community scientists, really, that are doing this. And they've been developing this for decades, right, for those communities. And here we are, we're just at the very, very beginning. We're just at the tip of the iceberg. I think we're just trying to play catch up.
And so people are saying here, like they're doing it elsewhere, other communities, but here in the San Joaquin Valley in Stockton, they're saying, oh, we've never done it that way. How are we? They're amazed, right, that you even want to take this on. But you've taken it on, right? Little Manila Rising is air monitoring.
Yeah. Well, like I said in the beginning, I mean, we took on the city and we saved the homes of over 50 families, in South Stockton. Like this is what we've done, right? And this is what we'll continue to do.
But talk about the air monitoring. You are air monitoring now because you're part of.
Well, we're just beginning. So we just received funding, and we've already put up several air monitors, but there are many more air monitors that need to be put up. There needs to be software that's developed that kind of creates the narrative of the data, right? And so in which we're interacting with systems with like weather flow, and we can actually see with our eyes where is the pollution coming from, which way are the winds blowing it, and there's actual graphical representation that shows these things. And then also there needs to be like a monitoring or like an alarm system which parents would have access to, in which they'll say they could receive a text and they say, don't let your children play outside right now. The air is terrible.
See,
right?
and this is where it comes back to the community. The information, self-air monitoring of the area is needed so that people are empowered and they know what kind of environment they're sending their kids out to or that they're going into so they can protect themselves. Is that sort of the idea, how it comes back to the community and the people?
But you would hope that just those engaged in the market would just want to do it, right?
Yeah.
Because it was the right thing to do, because we're facing major challenges with climate change. The air quality is getting worse and worse. The data is all there as far as asthma. In Stockton has some of the most worst cases of asthma. But then also understand that this is a market solution too, because what we found is that the number one reason for emergency room visits are all respiratory, right? And so what you're seeing is overpacked emergency rooms. And the thing is, oftentimes this is the only way many families, especially with lack of education of air quality and the effects on their children or whatever it may be, your first interaction with bad air quality to your health is in the emergency room, which is a much more expensive, right? And so society has to shoulder the burden of that cost. And so if we address this in the upfront, we would actually be saving a lot of money in the healthcare industry,
Yeah.
and run a more a better system, less impacted system.
Well,
So I think where we find ourselves right now as an organization is in this issue of de-siloing, right? Because not only are we engaging in environmental justice stuff, we're also engaging in public health, specifically towards asthma. And so right now, we're employing what's called a community health worker, which is a person that would come in and do asthma mitigation, in-home asthma mitigation. And so this person would come into a person's home, someone that may have been triggered, newly diagnosed asthma, and they would then mitigate the asthma triggers when someone's home. So for example, maybe they need to use better air filtration in their HVAC, or maybe they need to have a separate air monitoring system. Maybe there's a better, like, hypoallergenic bed sheets and pillowcases, all that kind of stuff. So they do that for families so that their children don't get triggered and don't have to make emergency room, possibly, die, sadly, of an asthma attack. And so we're doing that. But as we engage in the public health sector, one of the questions that they have is, what role specifically towards asthma does racial equity play in the work that we're doing? When I looked at it, I really thought about it. I came to the conclusion there's nothing, because public health doesn't come in until the diagnosis for asthma, right? And so the only cure for this public health situation is an environmental justice issue. Yet oftentimes these silos, whether it be, the health industry and the air quality industry, don't engage in the same space. Yeah. And so I think what we see ourselves doing is helping to try to de-silo and get these institutions to work together so that there can be actual healing in our community. Because the issue right now, there is no cure for asthma.
Yeah.
Like, you're diagnosed with it, there's no cure. It's something you have to live with for the rest of life. You have to carry an inhaler, right? And
the idea, though, is if you prevent it from happening in the first place, or take care of the pollution that may cause it, you may help the healthcare industry, because you wouldn't have to treat symptoms. People wouldn't have asthma. But it really is a whole approach, a preventive approach, which we're now only seeing people adopt in other areas like cancer, or other areas like diabetes, where we can treat symptoms once you have it, but then you have it, or we can try to prevent it by eating better, living better, being healthier, having a better, cleaner environment. It's just do it before it becomes a problem, because when you have a problem, then that's where you see problems with racial equity.
Yes.
People don't get the help they need. And I guess this is one of the things about the Dawn Project, once again named for Don Mabalan. This is the public health care worker going to homes and mitigating, asthma concerns.
Yeah. So the Dawn Project, which is an acronym which was coined by Elaine Labson, who's kind of spearheading this project for us. It's so Dawn, it's decreasing asthma within neighborhoods. We're now engaging in employing community health workers to help families mitigate the asthma triggers, as we have these folks meeting with families, mostly from marginalized communities who maybe don't have a trust of institutions and all that kind of stuff. I think, many of us who work in Little Manila were born and raised in South Stockton. I was a youth minister in at St. George's Church which is the Catholic church for South Stockton, for 21 years. And so the thing is, we have deep roots in our community, and we are able to access community because we're from it, unlike, big health institutions. If you have the community trust, do you just silo yourself off to, just historic preservation, right? When kind of the world's kind of crumbling around you. Like of the nonprofit world, like the most bougie nonprofit is the historic preservation, right? It's part of the reason why it's mostly like white historic sites that are preserved, because in order to preserve these buildings, you really have to have a thriving community, right? Because if other things are happening, why would you spend money to save a building when all these terrible other terrible things are happening in our society? And so really we still are focused on historic preservation, but in order to get there, there's a lot of healing that needs to happen in South Stockton.
Well, you're not just healing. Healing, yes, and also through the health, work that you're doing, the public health work you're doing, and not only are you saving the 3 buildings, and once again, the 3 buildings, I know I should have referenced them at the beginning, but they were name the 3 buildings.
Yeah, Mariposa Hotel, the Rizal Social Club, which is now no longer there, so there's only now 2 buildings, and what was the Filipino Recreation Hall. In more recent history, it was the Emerald Restaurant.
Right.
Yeah. So, of course, buildings have many lives.
So, the focus of Little Manila, when it becomes Little Manila Rising, is not just the saving and the preservation of buildings, but now it's really the saving of the people in the community, of people, real people, their health, their children, and trying to prevent people from.
Well, I mean, we run a lot of youth programs. So like, let's say we took control of the remaining buildings and started running programs out of them. I mean, how ethical would it be for us to run youth programs in the place that is in the 100th percentile for asthma related issues?
Yeah.
Right. And we know that young people or children, they are still developing their lungs. And so it is when you're young that you are most susceptible to getting asthma. So we really have to protect our young people from that. It would be unethical for us to be running youth programs right next to a freeway. One of them, that has huge traffic, a massive amount of trucks, diesel trucks, like PM 2.5, which is 2.5 particulate matter, which goes in to your lungs, but it's so small that it doesn't come out, right? Is what causes that.
There's a couple areas in the time we have remaining. We have a couple areas I want to touch on, and that is the last couple of years have been in COVID times. So I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about this idea of telling Little Manila Rising story. And one of the first things we did was we addressed, the cardboard and the SERP and the AB 617. One of the things that sort of got in our way was that there were gatekeepers, and there was a big issue about $5 million that was left, that the port had. There was some disagreement about Little Manila should send a message by rejecting the money from the port. And I just want to know, because I wrote a piece that was held from the Stockton Record. They would not run it. One of the problems about doing this project. But what was resolved about the $5 million from the port? I just want to know if that was ever concluded or ever resolved.
Yeah, nothing was resolved.
So the $5 million didn't go to the port. but the 5 million didn't come back to the community.
No.
Is the money then just lost, or is there a way it just goes back to the general budget?
Apparently.
So what about the relationship between the port and Little Manila Rising's presence at, as a community social justice player? Has that been smoothed over somewhat, or is it a better?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, they seem like they really want to clean our air. The thing is, though, that there are companies that are polluting that are literally trying to expand their footprint in the area. The environmental reports that they are creating, are saying that this would bring like tens of thousands more trucks into the heart of Stockton, which means they have to travel through Stockton. And so you would be increasing truck traffic. I think they're in support of that. So they may be saying, they want, to help and I think we are partnering with them. I think they're going to let us put some air monitors there, and they're going to let us plant trees, which is definitely what needs to happen. And we're appreciative of that.
Yeah.
But we're moving forward, because we got to move in partnership as a community. As you're seeing, like in the back of our minds is this, racial equity theater.
Yeah. Well, also it's this idea too that if we use that cap and trade model, if the pollution's going up, well, someone's going to have to pay for the increased pollution, and I guess that's one way to mitigate a problem that really never goes away, because as you're trying to mitigate it, you're increasing it on the other hand. It increases the pot because people are willing to pay for their pollution, but then there's more to clean up, and it's just it seems like an endless pollution cycle. But I guess we'll see what happens there. Let me move on to this other area. The last couple of years, as we've been fighting COVID-19, and that's had to affect how you run Little Manila Rising. How have you dealt with that, and how are you emerging as we cross our fingers and hope that Omicron is decreasing, and that, at some point, maybe by the summer, maybe at some point in 2022 late, we'll be back to whatever normal is defined as.
Right before the pandemic took off is when we were really just kind of rolling out our asthma mitigation stuff, specifically in South Stockton. I think it just became like a natural thing to then include COVID education and clinics into the mix. And, there wasn't like a huge amount of organizations that was specifically trying to serve South Stockton. And so, yeah, we added that because, I mean, how could you not, right? Like this is affecting everyone, right? And so we already had existing partnerships with other organizations in South Stockton, and so we worked together to help educate our community and provide vaccines for those in South Stockton.
But you were also expanding. You did other areas outside of South Stockton, and you had a get out the vaccine team that worked really for a good part of 2021 and up to the beginning of 2022, and also very effective. It got out the vaccine, and so the vaccination rates were raised really pretty significantly because of get out the vaccine efforts that were in part, due to Little Manila's group going out there. Yeah.
I mean, when you're in a crisis, community has to come together. I mean, you don't just sit around. You someone's house is on fire. You're throwing buckets of water until the fire department shows up, right?
Yeah.
And I think we were in a position to try to help, yeah. and we just kind of stepped up. I think that's what it was. It's ridiculous to think about it, because just I don't know, a little over 2 years ago, we had 3 staff, and then at the height of all of our vaccine outreach, we were close to, I think, 35 employees.
Wow. Wow.
While doing that, we had to increase the infrastructure of our organization to handle that responsibility, right? Like
Yeah.
that's how I find myself. I got my degree in film and ethnic studies. I think it comes down to the original story of Little Manila, of the story of Don and I emerging from college, literally just trying to figure out how we're gonna pay back our student loans, and the lack of an infrastructure for us to make an impact on our own personal community at that time, right? Like, wow, they're destroying our buildings. Who do we go to? Right? Who's going to help us? Who can we help to fight this? And that was our mindset. And then found out there's no one. And then realized, oh, we have to build something ourselves, right? And so over the years, I think I've started coming to the realization that, at least to me, in my role as an executive director now, is that how do we build an institutions in our community so that young people and people that have been marginalized historically have a way to make direct impact upon community. And it really speaks to the origins of Little Manila. It was just people who grew up in South Stockton, who never had control, who didn't get a say in saying, yeah, I believe 90% of industry should be zoned in Stockton, which, we never had a say in that. But I do think that people that live in a community should have a right to shape that community, not just culturally, but also physically as well. And so at that time, our thing was, we want to save those buildings. And the response from the city was, well, who the hell are you to, what I'm saying? You don't own the buildings, right? Like, which is a really sad thing to say, because, the Alien Land Act wouldn't allow Filipinos to own property. Right. Yeah. Which is, like, if you understand the history, like, you don't realize how racist that. I mean, the only reason why our community didn't own those buildings is because it was a racist law that didn't allow us to do that. And so, like, people don't even realize they're being racist when they say things, right? I mean, that's why equity is important. If you don't understand the history, you can't get to what equity is. And we were coming from a historical perspective. And so I think what's happening now is we're just expanding upon that, right? To not just the story of the Manang Manong generation, right? And they faced many issues, many, I mean, sky's the limit, right?
Yeah.
Like, whether you're, the story of field work, the story of becoming, of colonization, American colonization, Spanish colonization. I mean, we could just go on and on. The issues that, the fact that they weren't part of the New Deal, right? Like, during the Great Depression, they had to form their own infrastructure to save themselves. I mean, I feel like we're totally coming from that tradition, right? We're totally coming from that tradition.
Well, what you're talking about now is not just saving 3 buildings, but and not just talking about saving, you've expanded to talking savings people's lives, but now you're also talking about developing an entire community, having a say in the development of everything that goes on in that community, which is, it's quite an evolution from when Little Manila started, when I first met you in 2003.
Yeah, yes and no.
That's all right.
because in 2003 we did turn in a redevelopment plan for an area.
All right.
Right. Like, literally, we were saying, but what we did was we brought the community together. Right.
All right. The germ was there. The germ was there for redevelopment. Yeah. All right. So, but now it is truly, this is sort of where Little Manila Rising seems to be going, into a community development player.
Oh, we hope so. I mean, we're trying to build capacity to do that.
What would that mean? What would that mean to be a community development player?
The ownership of land and developing on that land.
And what sort of things? The next Rizal Social Club? The next.
I don't know. It could be anything. It could be a community clinic in South Stockton. It could be more room for the arts, performance space in South Stockton. right? All these like really cool things that other communities have. You know, the funny thing is other communities have this, right? But I think South Stockton is so marginalized, like we don't even know. You mean we had a right to do things, right? Like if you look at the seeds of some of the work that we've done, right? Like just the fact, one of the things we created a youth-led effort to name one of the new Stockton Unified School District school for Flora Arcamata, right? The first Filipino teacher in Stockton Unified School District, and one of the first teachers of color in Stockton Unified School District. If you come from an old school mindset, right? What audacity do these people have to name something? They don't even live in that area, right? That comes from a culture of true continued colonization and racism, that a community doesn't have a right to have a say. I mean, I think they've done that in the past. They're like, oh, what do you guys want to do? Like, we have this one name. Do you guys really like this name? Let's check off that box, right? Yeah. But here, we did that, but we did that purposefully because what those kids or those young adults, those young students get to do 20 years from now, 30 years from now? They get to drive by that school with their children in the back seat, and they said, hey, see that school right there, Flora Arcamata? I helped name that school. And I think that was an experience that Don and I got to have when now I have kids and I get to say, hey, see those two buildings? Like, we helped save that, right? Like, we worked our butts off and we saved it. And why did we say we saved it for you, right? And it's something that our communities never had, like that power, I think, in America. It's something, especially when you're talking about the colonization of the Philippines and hundreds and hundreds of years of colonization. That's what we're battling, because when you're colonized people, basically an outside entity is coming in and then saying, you do not have the right to govern yourselves or to shape, right, your community, or to, all that kind of stuff. When Dawn passed away, I I made the statement, when I eulogized her, that she was the most decolonized out of all of us, because she saw the beauty in all of it and stood up and said, this is worth saving. And she said that with the buildings. And then when we met with those families, right, who were about to lose their homes, that definition expanded. We said, these families, their homes are worth saving, right? And I think now we just expand that too. Like, we got into this because we saw a wrecking ball in front of, what is now the McDonald's, right? They destroyed that block to build the McDonald's and the gas station, and there was nothing we could do about it. And I think, yeah, that happened in 1999, 2000. But now I really kind of see marginalization is the fact that there is a wrecking ball in front of every one of our young children, our families, our own homes. If we're facing these issues, environmental justice, the shortening of life because of pollution, the lack of outreach to poor communities for COVID education, there is a wrecking ball still. I don't think anything's changed from where we started. I think we've just consistently applied our efforts or our feelings at the time as young people growing up. Now we're old, right? And Don's gone. But I think we haven't changed that much. We've just empowered ourselves to expand things that need to be saved.
And that is the ongoing story of Little Manila Rising. From the mouth of Dillon Delvo, executive director.
Yeah.
Dillon.
And people just keep on just saying, hey, you're a Filipino, which is great. And we embrace it and all that kind of stuff. But we don't want to stay in our lane.
Yeah.
I think we have a right to grow in the way that a community deems it necessary, right? And that is, becoming decolonized. Right.
I remember when you said that, I was in the church when you eulogized Don, and I wrote a piece for The Record, an editorial, an op-ed. I'm not an employee of The Record now, but I remember that line.
The most decolonized.
And it just struck me because that really is the driver, the motivation. And it really is the story of Little Manila Rising. So, Dillon Delvo, if I've left out anything you want to add?
No, I think we're good. I think, we'll keep on working and, hopefully just make a difference. It's, I never thought that this Little Manila journey would take over my life, but it has. And I think it's definitely a beautiful thing.
All right, Dillon. Thanks for the time. Thanks for letting me see how it all works. Limited by COVID, of course, but it's an interesting, fascinating story, the evolution. Here's one last question. Is this potentially a model for other groups, for future Filipino activists, future BIPOC activists?
Well, I think the model has already been created. I mean, there are many, many amazing community groups that have come out before us, right? Like we can take it all the way back to the Manongs, right? And the way they organized in the fields and the strikes that they led. So there are plenty of models out there. I think this is just the way we're trying to implement it specifically for South Stockton. If anything, I think we want to encourage, more folks to be able to do this work, because we don't see ourselves as the end all solution, even just the South Stockton. I think we need more people involved and more allies and more groups and more representation fighting. And we are trying to make that happen. We are a fiscal sponsor for a couple organizations that are just trying to get started at the moment right now. And so, yeah, that's definitely in our understanding. And like I said, I don't think we're the end all solution. I think it's going to take a real renaissance to change the way we think and change the culture of our community, so that marginalization is not something that has to happen to any family. Anyone actually truly has a chance to shape community and to access power. I think we come from a long tradition of folks in America. We, are definitely looking toward the trailblazers in the Black community, all the other communities that have fought for racial and social justice.
Dillon Delvo on the expanded goals of the nonprofit Little Manila Rising, as it looks to bring marginalized groups in Stockton together to shape their community and access the power and the public funds denied them for decades. Dillon Delvo, the executive director there at the nonprofit Little Manila Rising in South Stockton. You can contact me at www.amok.com. Listen wherever you podcast for more Emil Amok's Takeout, including more episodes on Little Manila Rising. You can join me daily for the live-streamed Emil Amok's Takeout, Monday through Friday live at 2 p.m. Pacific on Facebook. That's at facebook.com/EmilGuillermo.media or on Emil Guillermo, the YouTube channel, and recorded later on amok.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Emil Guillermo.